The cold, damp air stung Jake's skin as he slowly regained consciousness. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred, but the sharp clank of metal echoed in his ears, forcing him awake. As his eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering light, he realized he wasn't in his bed, or even anywhere familiar. The rough, jagged walls around him glowed faintly orange, as if reflecting the light of distant fire. His heart began to race. He tried to move, but his arms wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he looked down and saw thick, rusted chains binding his wrists and ankles. The metal bit into his skin, leaving raw, red marks. The floor beneath him was hard stone, slick with something dark and sticky. Was that blood? His pulse quickened. Where am I? Jake's memory was hazy. The last thing he remembered was walking home from the outpost near the woods, the sky darkening as the two moons rose. Then, a shadow, a roar and blinding pain. He must have been ambushed. But by what? A low, rumbling growl echoed through the cavern, vibrating the very ground beneath him. Jake froze. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. It was deeper, primal, something ancient. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he struggled to stay calm. But the chains rattled loudly with every movement, betraying his fear. Then he heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. No, not footsteps. Claws. They scraped against the stone floor, each step sending a shiver down his spine. The light grew brighter as the creature approached, illuminating the massive cavern. The walls were lined with bones, human bones, piled high like trophies. Jake's stomach churned, and then he saw it. A monstrous figure emerged from the shadows, its scales glistening like molten metal in the firelight. It was a dragon, but unlike any from the stories. This was no mythical beast. It was real, alive, and terrifying. Its eyes burned like twin suns, and its teeth, sharp as daggers, dripped with saliva. The creature's wings unfurled, casting a massive shadow that swallowed Jake whole. This was Vorak, the Drakith King. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He was nothing more than a snack to this beast, a sacrifice. He could see it in Vorak's eyes. The hunger, the anticipation. This was routine for the dragon. Humans were just food. But as Vorak stepped closer, something strange happened. Instead of succumbing to the overwhelming fear, Jake felt a spark deep within him. It wasn't courage, not exactly, but something older, something primal. His fear didn't make him weaker. It made him angry. Angry that he was being treated like prey. Angry that humans had been reduced to this. Vorak opened his massive jaws, a deep growl rumbling from his throat. The heat of his breath singed Jake's skin, but Jake didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the dragon's, and for the first time in his life, Jake felt something he couldn't explain, a surge of defiance. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this. The chains around his wrists began to tremble, not from the dragon's roar, but from Jake himself. His muscles tensed, and with a sudden, explosive force, he pulled. The metal groaned under the pressure, but Jake didn't stop. His vision blurred, his head pounded, but still he pulled. And then, snap, the chains shattered, falling to the ground in a heap. Jake stumbled to his feet, his body shaking, not from fear, but from the strange, newfound strength coursing through his veins. Vorak reared back, clearly surprised. No human had ever broken free before. This wasn't supposed to happen. But Jake was no ordinary human. Grabbing a sharp piece of metal from the floor, a fragment of some ancient weapon, Jake faced the dragon. His hands trembled, but his eyes were steady. For the first time in history, a human wasn't running from a dragon. He was ready to fight. Vorak's eyes narrowed, the glow within them intensifying as he stared at the small, defiant figure before him. The great dragon's nostrils flared, releasing twin streams of smoke that coiled in the hot air of the cavern. Jake felt the ground vibrate with the beast's low, guttural growl, but he didn't step back. The jagged shard of metal in his hand felt pitifully small compared to the towering mass of scales and muscle before him. But he gripped it tightly, knuckles white, heart pounding like a war drum. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Jake could hear his own breathing, feel the sweat trickling down his temple, mingling with the dirt and blood on his face. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to hide, to submit to the inevitable. But something deep inside, something raw and ancient, kept him rooted to the spot. His fear wasn't paralyzing. It was sharpening him, focusing every fiber of his being. Vorak let out a thunderous roar that shook the very walls of the cavern. The force of it hit Jake like a physical blow, the heat from the dragon's breath searing his skin. But even as his ears rang and his vision blurred from the sheer intensity of the sound, Jake didn't drop his makeshift weapon. Instead, he tightened his grip, feeling a strange energy surge through his veins, as if his fear was being converted into something else, something powerful. The dragon lunged. Vorak's massive jaws snapped shut where Jake had been just a heartbeat before. Rolling to the side, Jake barely avoided becoming a smear on the cavern floor. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline pumping through his body, fueling his movements with a speed and agility he didn't know he had. The shard of metal slashed out almost on its own, catching the dragon's thick hide and leaving a shallow gash along its side. Vorak roared in fury, more out of shock than pain. No human had ever dared strike him. Jake didn't give him time to recover. He darted forward again, this time aiming for the dragon's eyes, the only part of its body that looked even remotely vulnerable. But Vorak was fast, far faster than Jake had anticipated. A massive claw swiped through the air, catching Jake across the ribs and sending him sprawling against the cavern wall. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and for a moment, everything went black. But that same strange force inside him wouldn't let him stay down. His vision cleared, and the pain in his side, while sharp and burning, felt distant, as though his body had decided it simply didn't have time to process it. He pushed himself up, spitting blood onto the stone floor, and faced Vorak again. The dragon was watching him now with something more than hunger. There was curiosity there, and a flicker of doubt. Jake could see it in those molten eyes. Vorak wasn't used to his prey fighting back, and certainly not surviving this long. Jake realized something in that moment, something important. Vorak wasn't just a mindless beast. He was intelligent, calculating. And like any predator, he thrived on fear. The dragons had ruled for so long because humans had let them, cowering and submitting without resistance. But Jake wasn't afraid anymore. He stood tall, ignoring the blood seeping from his wounds, and stared Vorak down. The dragon snarled, but there was hesitation in his movements now, as if he wasn't sure what to make of this defiant human. Jake took a step forward, then another, his confidence growing with each heartbeat. "You're not going to eat me," Jake growled, his voice hoarse but steady. "Not today." Vorak roared in frustration and lunged again, his massive jaws wide, teeth gleaming in the firelight. But Jake was ready. He waited until the last possible second, then dove to the side, rolling beneath the dragon's belly. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he drove the shard of metal into the soft flesh where the scales were thinnest. The dragon shrieked, a sound that echoed through the cavern like a dying storm. Vorak thrashed wildly, his tail smashing into the stone walls, sending shards of rock raining down from the ceiling. Jake was thrown across the floor, his body battered and bruised, but he didn't let go of his weapon. He scrambled to his feet once more, adrenaline dulling the pain, and prepared for another strike. But Vorak didn't attack again. The dragon stumbled back, eyes wide with something Jake never thought he'd see in a creature like this. Fear. Blood dripped from the wound in its belly, pooling on the cavern floor. Vorak let out a low guttural growl, then retreated into the shadows, leaving Jake standing alone in the flickering firelight. Breathing hard, Jake stared into the darkness where the dragon had disappeared. His body ached, and every muscle screamed in protest, but he was still standing. Against all odds, he had survived. But more importantly, he had made Vorak bleed. Jake knew this wasn't over. The dragon would be back, and next time, he wouldn't make the same mistakes. But Jake wasn't the same either. Something had awakened inside him, something that couldn't be chained or silenced. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for all of humanity. And for the first time in generations, the dragons had a reason to fear. The cavern trembled with the echo of Vorak's retreating roars, but Jake didn't waste time savoring his unlikely victory. His heart still pounded like a war drum in his chest, and the burning pain from his injuries was starting to creep back into his awareness. His ribs felt like they were on fire, and his left arm throbbed from where he'd slammed into the wall. But none of that mattered right now. He was still alive, and that was something no other human who had stood in this cavern could claim. Jake staggered to his feet, the sharp shard of metal still clutched tightly in his hand. His knuckles were white, not from fear, but from a raw, defiant determination that refused to fade. Vorak might have fled, but the dragon wouldn't be gone for long. When he came back, it wouldn't be alone. Jake could almost hear the angry roars of the other Draketh in the distance, their fury stirred by the impossible news. A human had not only resisted but had wounded their king. Jake limped toward the shadows at the edge of the cavern, his mind racing. He had to escape before the dragons regrouped, but escaping from a place like this wasn't going to be easy. The cave was a labyrinth, and the dragons knew its every twist and turn. Jake had no idea where he was or how far underground he'd been dragged, but he knew one thing: if he stayed here, he'd be dead. As he slipped deeper into the tunnels, the oppressive heat from Vorak's lair began to fade, replaced by a cold, damp chill that seeped into his bones. The flickering orange glow of the cavern gave way to near total darkness, and Jake had to feel his way along the rough, jagged walls. Every sound echoed through the tunnels: the distant dripping of water, the faint rustle of unseen creatures, and most ominously, the distant, growing roars of dragons hunting their escaped prey. Jake's breathing was ragged, his chest tight with pain, but he pushed forward. His mind was sharp, driven by the same force that had allowed him to break his chains and stand up to Vorak. He wasn't just running anymore, he was thinking. Every turn he took, every path he chose, was calculated. The dragons were stronger, faster, and nearly invincible, but Jake had something they didn't: human cunning. As he moved deeper into the tunnels, Jake's eyes began to adjust to the darkness. Strange, faintly glowing symbols adorned the walls, ancient markings carved into the stone itself. Jake paused, his curiosity overcoming his desperation for just a moment. He traced his fingers over the symbols, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips. They were old, far older than anything he'd ever seen, but something about them felt familiar, as if a part of him recognized the shapes, the patterns. The symbols weren't random. They told a story. Jake's mind raced as he pieced together the meaning behind the carvings. The images showed humans standing tall, weapons in hand, facing down dragons. But the humans in these carvings weren't the weak, fearful creatures Jake had always known his people to be. They were warriors, proud, strong, unafraid. In one section, a figure that looked distinctly human was shown breaking free from chains, much like Jake had just done. Surrounding the figure were swirling lines of energy, almost as if the person was drawing power from within themselves. Jake's eyes widened as the realization sank in. Humans weren't always slaves. Something had happened, something that had buried this history and reduced his people to little more than cattle for the Draketh. But the potential, the strength, it was still there, hidden deep within their blood. Whatever had awakened inside Jake during his confrontation with Vorak was part of that ancient legacy. The dragons had tried to erase this history, but they had failed. A sudden, sharp roar echoed through the tunnels, snapping Jake back to the present. The Draketh were getting closer. He didn't have time to dwell on ancient history right now. But as he turned and continued deeper into the labyrinth, a new determination settled in his chest. He wasn't just escaping for himself anymore. He had to survive, to find others, to tell them what he'd learned. Humanity wasn't meant to be dragon food. They were meant to fight. The tunnels twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing so much Jake had to squeeze through tight gaps, his injuries screaming in protest. Other times, the passages opened into vast chambers filled with the remnants of old battles, rusted weapons, shattered bones, and more of those ancient carvings. Every step he took seemed to reinforce what he'd just discovered. The Draketh had ruled for so long by keeping humans in the dark, but Jake had seen the truth now, and that truth was a weapon. Eventually, Jake stumbled upon a narrow passage that sloped upward. The air grew colder and fresher, and hope surged in his chest. An exit. But just as he was about to push forward, he heard it. The heavy, unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. The dragons were here. They'd found his trail. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, not in his condition. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. He ducked into a side tunnel, pressing himself against the wall and steadying his breath. The shard of metal in his hand felt heavy, but he wasn't planning on using it. Not directly, anyway. His eyes darted around, searching the darkness for anything he could use. Then he saw it, a loose section of rock above the tunnel entrance, barely held in place. If he could time it right, he could trigger a collapse and trap the dragons behind him. The roars grew louder, closer. Jake waited, heart pounding in his chest, until he saw the faint glow of firelight reflecting off the tunnel walls. The first dragon rounded the corner, its massive form barely fitting in the narrow space. Now, Jake hurled the metal shard at the weak spot in the rock, and with a deafening crack, the ceiling gave way. Tons of stone crashed down, sealing the tunnel and cutting off the dragon's advance. The roar of frustration from the other side was almost deafening, but Jake didn't wait to celebrate. He turned and ran, every ounce of strength he had left driving him forward. The slope grew steeper, the air colder, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it, a faint glimmer of light ahead. Jake stumbled out of the tunnel and into the open night. The cool air hit his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he took a deep, ragged breath of freedom. The stars stretched out above him, and the twin moons bathed the landscape in pale light. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. Vorak would come for him. The dragons would hunt him. But Jake wasn't afraid, because now he knew the truth. And that truth would set humanity free. The night sky stretched above Jake like a vast, endless canvas, dotted with stars that seemed to pulse with the same energy coursing through his veins. The cool air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of Vorak's lair, but it brought no comfort. Jake's body was battered, his wounds aching with every step, but his mind burned with a single, undeniable truth. Humans were never meant to be slaves. Staggering across the rocky terrain, Jake tried to piece together everything he'd seen in the tunnels. The carvings, the ancient symbols, they told a story of a past long forgotten, a time when humans stood as equals against the Draketh. That strength, that power, hadn't been lost. It had been buried, hidden deep within their blood, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, Jake was living proof that it could be reclaimed. But the question that gnawed at his mind was why? Why had the Draketh gone to such lengths to erase this history? Why enslave humanity if they once saw them as worthy adversaries? The answers were out there, buried in the past. But Jake knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the only one who could awaken this strength. Others could fight too. They just needed to remember who they were. The landscape around him was harsh and unforgiving. Jagged cliffs and twisted trees casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Jake moved as quickly as his battered body would allow, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter or danger. The Draketh wouldn't let him go easily. Vorak's humiliation wouldn't be tolerated, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the dragon sent hunters after him. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Jake stumbled upon something unexpected. Nestled between two rocky outcroppings was what appeared to be the entrance to an ancient structure, partially buried by time and erosion. The stone doorway was marked with the same strange symbols he'd seen in the tunnels. His heart pounded. This place wasn't just old, it was important. Summoning what little strength he had left, Jake pushed through the heavy stone door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Faint light from cracks in the ceiling illuminated the vast chamber within, revealing more carvings along the walls. Stories of battles fought and victories won, of humans standing tall against the Draketh. But something else caught Jake's eye. At the far end of the chamber, partially hidden beneath a collapsed pillar, was a figure. For a heart-stopping moment, Jake thought it was another skeleton, another forgotten warrior lost to time. But then the figure moved. Jake's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but curiosity and desperation drove him forward. As he approached, he saw that the figure was a woman, her clothes tattered and face smeared with dirt. Her eyes, however, were sharp and alert, filled with a mix of suspicion and surprise as they locked onto Jake. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I could ask you the same," Jake replied, his voice rough but steady. "Name's Jake." The woman eyed him for a moment longer before nodding slightly. "Ava," she said. "I thought I was the last one." Jake helped her to her feet, noticing the faint scars along her arms and the way she favored one leg. She'd been through her own battles. That much was clear. But there was a fire in her eyes, a spark that mirrored the one Jake felt burning inside him. "I don't know how long you've been here," Jake began, "but things are changing. The Draketh, they're not invincible." Ava's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Jake quickly recounted his escape, the fight with Vorak, and the strange strength that had surged through him. Ava listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to cautious hope. "You're not the only one," she finally said. "There are others, scattered, hiding, afraid. But if what you're saying is true, maybe it's time we stop hiding." Jake nodded, feeling a surge of relief. He wasn't alone in this. Ava knew more about the world outside the dragon's control, and together they could find the others. They could build something stronger than fear. Over the next few days, Ava led Jake through hidden paths and secret tunnels, navigating the treacherous landscape with the ease of someone who had spent years surviving in the shadows. They encountered other survivors, small groups of humans who had escaped the Draketh's grasp, but had long since lost any hope of fighting back. When Jake told them his story, showed them the scars from his battle with Vorak, he saw something flicker in their eyes. Doubt, at first, then disbelief. But slowly that disbelief turned into something stronger. Hope. As the group grew, so did their resolve. Ava and Jake trained them, teaching them how to harness their hidden strength. It wasn't easy. Many of them had been broken by years of oppression, but the spark was there, buried beneath layers of fear and submission. All it needed was a little fuel. But time was running out. The Draketh were hunting them, and Vorak's fury was unmatched. Jake knew that the dragons wouldn't stop until they were crushed, until every human who dared to resist was turned to ash. But Jake wasn't afraid. He'd faced Vorak and lived. And now, with an army of awakened humans by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Standing at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the valley below where the Draketh stronghold loomed, Jake clenched his fists. The ancient carvings had told a story of defeat, of humans being brought to their knees. But now, they were writing a new story, one of rebellion, of strength, of a future free from dragon rule. "This isn't just about surviving anymore," Jake said, his voice steady and strong as the rebels gathered behind him. "This is about taking back what's ours. The dragons thought they could break us, erase who we are. But they were wrong. Ava stepped forward, her eyes blazing. It's time we remind them what it means to be human. And with that, they descended into the valley, ready to ignite the spark that would set the world on fire. The air was thick with tension as Jake and Ava led the growing group of rebels through the dense, twisting forest. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the ground. Every step felt heavy, not just from the physical exhaustion, but from the weight of what lay ahead. For the first time in generations, humans were preparing to fight back against the Dragoth, and the stakes couldn't be higher. They had spent weeks gathering survivors, training in secret, and learning to harness the ancient strength that Jake had discovered within himself. The more people they found, the more stories they heard, stories of oppression, of loss, but also of quiet resistance. It turned out humanity had never fully surrendered. Their spirit had simply been buried under layers of fear and hopelessness. But now, that spirit was awakening. Jake stood at the edge of a clearing, staring out at the distant silhouette of the Dragoth stronghold. The massive stone fortress jutted out from the cliffs like a jagged wound on the landscape, its towers reaching toward the sky as if trying to claw down the very stars. Fires burned in the watchtowers, casting an ominous glow over the valley below, where the dragon army gathered in preparation for their next raid on the remaining human settlements. Jake's jaw tightened. They couldn't let that happen. Ava approached, her footsteps silent despite the underbrush. She studied the fortress for a moment, then turned to Jake, her eyes sharp and focused. "We can't take them head on," she said quietly. "Not yet, but we can make them bleed." Jake nodded. They both knew this battle wasn't about total victory. Not yet. This was about sending a message, about showing the Dragoth that humans weren't afraid anymore. They would hit the dragons where it hurt, disrupt their control, and inspire others to rise up. It was the first step in a much larger war. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of purple and crimson, the rebels gathered in the clearing. There were nearly 100 of them now, men and women of all ages, hardened by years of suffering, but united by a common purpose. Jake could see the fear in their eyes, but beneath that fear was something stronger: determination. He stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed them. "Tonight, we show the Dragoth they've made a mistake. They thought they could break us, that we'd stay in the shadows forever. But we're done hiding. We're done being afraid. We fight not just for ourselves, but for every human they've ever tried to crush, for every life they've taken, for every future they tried to steal." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder until it became a unified roar of defiance. The sound sent a thrill down Jake's spine. This was more than just a group of survivors. This was the beginning of a revolution. The plan was simple but risky. They would split into smaller groups, each targeting a different part of the fortress. Their goal was to create chaos, to weaken the Dragoth's grip on the region, and inspire other human settlements to rise up. Jake and Ava would lead the main assault, drawing the dragon's attention while the others sabotaged supply lines and freed captured humans from the fortress dungeons. As the rebels dispersed into the night, Jake and Ava crept through the shadows toward the fortress. The closer they got, the more Jake's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was what he'd been building toward since the moment he'd broken free from Vorac's chains. The fortress walls loomed ahead, tall and imposing, but Jake wasn't intimidated. He could feel the ancient strength humming beneath his skin, the same power that had allowed him to face Vorac and survive. He glanced at Ava, who gave him a quick nod before scaling the wall with practiced ease. Jake followed, his movements fluid and silent despite the pain in his ribs. Once inside, they moved quickly through the narrow corridors, avoiding patrols and sticking to the shadows. The fortress was a maze of stone and fire, filled with the sounds of clashing steel and the distant roars of dragons. But Jake's focus never wavered. They had a mission, and nothing was going to stop them. They reached the central courtyard, where a massive bonfire blazed, illuminating the gathering of Draketh soldiers. Vorak wasn't there, but his presence was felt in every corner of the fortress. The Dragon King's lieutenants, smaller but no less deadly, patrolled the area, their scaled bodies glistening in the firelight. Jake took a deep breath, then signaled to Ava. They moved as one, launching their attack with precision and speed. Jake's makeshift blade found its mark, cutting through the vulnerable joints in the Draketh's armor. Ava was a blur of motion beside him, her movements deadly and efficient. The element of surprise was on their side, and for a moment, it seemed like they might actually pull this off without heavy losses. But then the alarm sounded. A deafening roar echoed through the fortress, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see Vorak emerging from the shadows, his massive form illuminated by the flickering flames. The Dragon King's eyes burned with fury as he took in the scene before him, his fortress under attack, his soldiers falling to human blades. Vorak let out a roar that shook the very walls of the fortress, and Jake knew they had to move fast. He grabbed Ava's arm, pulling her toward the nearest exit, but Vorak was faster. The dragon lunged, his massive claws raking through the air. Jake barely managed to dodge, the heat from Vorak's breath searing his skin. The rebels fought valiantly, but the Draketh's numbers were overwhelming. Jake could see his people falling, their newfound strength not enough to withstand the full fury of the dragons. But even as the battle seemed lost, Jake refused to give up. He turned to face Vorak, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You'll never break us," he growled, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We're not your food. We're not your slaves. We're human, and we will fight." Vorak roared in response, his massive form lunging forward. But Jake was ready. He dove to the side, using the dragon's momentum against him. Vorak crashed into the fortress wall, the impact sending cracks spiderwebbing through the stone. Taking advantage of the distraction, Jake rallied the remaining rebels, leading them in a final desperate charge. They fought with everything they had, their determination shining brighter than the flames consuming the fortress. In the end, they didn't win the battle, but they didn't need to. They had lit the spark of rebellion, and that fire would spread. As the rebels retreated into the night, leaving the smoldering ruins of the fortress behind, Jake knew this was just the beginning. The Draketh had felt their defiance, and Vorak had seen that humans wouldn't cower in fear anymore. The war for humanity's freedom had begun, and Jake was ready to see it through to the end. Smoke curled into the dark sky, mingling with the stars as the remnants of the battle smoldered behind them. Jake's chest heaved with exhaustion, his body screaming from wounds both old and new. The rebels moved quietly around him, their footsteps heavy with the weight of loss. The fortress was not theirs, but they had taken something far more important, the dragon's certainty. The retreat had been brutal. Jake had led the survivors through winding forest paths, their bodies battered and spirits frayed. But in every pair of human eyes, even through the pain and exhaustion, Jake saw a glimmer of something he hadn't seen before: belief. They had faced the Draketh, wounded their pride, and survived. That alone was more powerful than any weapon they carried. By the time they reached their hidden camp nestled deep in the mountains, dawn was breaking. The rebels collapsed into makeshift shelters, tending to their wounds and counting their dead. But Jake didn't rest. He stood at the edge of the camp, staring out at the horizon where the fortress had once loomed. Vorak would not let this insult go unanswered. The Dragon King had tasted human defiance, and his hunger for revenge would be insatiable. Ava approached quietly, her face marked with soot and streaked with dried blood. She stood beside Jake in silence for a moment, the weight of the battle heavy between them. "They'll come for us," she finally said, her voice low but steady. Jake nodded. "Let them." Ava glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "We're not ready for a full assault, Jake. Vorak will bring everything he has." Jake's jaw clenched. He knew she was right. The Draketh were still stronger, their numbers overwhelming. But Jake also knew something had changed. The battle at the fortress wasn't just a skirmish, it was a message. And that message had spread faster than dragonfire. Other human settlements, long hidden or oppressed, had seen the smoke, heard the roars, and now they knew the truth. Humans could fight back. Over the next few days, word of the rebellion spread like wildfire. Small groups of survivors and fighters began arriving at the rebel camp. People who had once believed resistance was futile, now ready to take up arms. The camp transformed from a ragtag group of fugitives into a burgeoning army. Blacksmiths forged new weapons from salvaged metal, scouts mapped out dragon patrol routes, and strategists, many of whom had lived under Draketh rule for years, shared vital intelligence about the dragon's weaknesses. But Jake knew that numbers alone wouldn't win this war. The Draketh were ancient, their power unmatched by sheer force. What humans needed was an edge, something the dragons wouldn't expect. And Jake had an idea. Late one night, as the camp lay in restless sleep, Jake gathered Ava and a few trusted rebels around the campfire. The flames danced in their eyes, reflecting the determination etched into their faces. "We can't just wait for Vorak to find us," Jake began, his voice low but firm. "We need to strike first, and we need to hit him where it hurts." Ava frowned, her arms crossed over her chest. "We've already hit the fortress. It rattled them, but it didn't break them." Jake shook his head. The fortress was just a symbol. Vorak's real power isn't just in his strength, it's in fear. We need to destroy that. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They knew fear was the Draketh's greatest weapon, but they also knew it wouldn't be easy to dismantle centuries of domination. Jake leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a fierce light. The Draketh have something they're hiding, something that ties into the ancient strength we've been awakening. The carvings in the tunnels, the symbols on the walls. They're not just stories. They're instructions, clues to what we once were and what we can be again. Ava's eyes narrowed. "You think there's more to this power?" "I know there is," Jake said. "And Vorak knows it too. That's why they've spent centuries trying to erase our history. They're afraid of what we might become." A tense silence settled over the group as they absorbed Jake's words. Finally, Ava spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's the plan?" Jake's lips curled into a grim smile. "We're going to find the source of our strength, and then we're going to use it to end Vorak." The journey to uncover humanity's hidden power wasn't easy. Jake and a small team ventured deep into uncharted territory, guided by the ancient symbols and stories passed down by the oldest survivors. They navigated treacherous mountain paths, crossed crumbling bridges over raging rivers, and fought off wild Draketh scouts who prowled the outskirts of their domain. Weeks passed, and doubt began to gnaw at the edges of Jake's resolve. But just when hope seemed to wane, they found it. A hidden temple carved into the side of a mountain, its entrance sealed with massive stone doors covered in ancient human script. The temple pulsed with a strange energy, the very air around it humming with power. Inside, the walls were lined with murals depicting the ancient war between humans and Draketh. But these humans weren't weak, cowering in fear. They were radiant, their bodies surrounded by a glowing aura of energy. They wielded weapons forged from materials Jake had never seen, their eyes burning with the same fierce light he'd seen in his own reflection. At the heart of the temple, they found it, a crystalline artifact, pulsating with a soft, blue glow. Jake approached it cautiously, feeling the energy thrumming beneath his skin. The moment his fingers touched the surface, a surge of power shot through him, unlike anything he'd ever felt. His mind flooded with memories, not his own, but those of ancient warriors who had fought and nearly defeated the Draketh long ago. This was it, the key to humanity's true strength. Jake returned to the camp with the artifact, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The rebels gathered around as he explained what they had found, and how it could change everything. The artifact wasn't just a weapon, it was a catalyst, something that could awaken the dormant power in every human. They began training immediately, using the artifact to unlock their hidden potential. The transformation was incredible. Rebels who had once struggled to lift a sword now moved with the speed and precision of seasoned warriors. Their strength grew, their confidence soared, and for the first time in generations, humanity had the upper hand. But with this newfound power came a cost. The Drakith felt the shift in the balance of power, and Vorek's rage knew no bounds. He gathered his forces, an army larger and more fearsome than anything the humans had faced before. The final battle was inevitable. As the rebel army prepared for the coming fight, Jake stood at the edge of the camp, staring out at the horizon. The sky was heavy with storm clouds, the distant rumble of thunder echoing like a warning. Ava approached, her eyes steady and calm. "Are we ready?" she asked. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the power coursing through his veins. He thought of all they had lost, all they had fought for, and all they stood to gain. "We're ready," he said, his voice filled with unwavering determination. And so are they. The time had come to face Vorak and the Drakith once and for all. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the future of humanity. And this time, the dragons would fall. The battlefield stretched out before Jake, a vast expanse of broken earth and jagged rocks under a sky heavy with storm clouds. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the distant roars of dragons and the faint, defiant cries of humanity rising to meet them. Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if the very heavens were preparing for the clash to come. Jake tightened his grip on the hilt of his blade, feeling the ancient power pulsing beneath his skin. This was the moment they had fought for, the final confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity. Behind him, the rebel army stood ready. They were no longer the frightened, scattered survivors he had first encountered. Their eyes burned with the same fierce determination that Jake felt in his own heart. They had trained, bled, and grown stronger together, their hidden potential awakened by the artifact Jake had found in the ancient temple. Now, they were warriors, standing tall against the enemy that had oppressed them for generations. Across the field, the Drakith army gathered like a storm on the horizon. Their massive, scaled bodies shimmered in the dim light, wings unfurling with a sound like cracking thunder. At the forefront of the horde stood Vorak, his colossal form towering above his kin. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, his jaws curled into a snarl of pure fury. The humiliation Jake had dealt him at the fortress had festered into a seething rage, and now the Dragon King sought to crush the rebellion once and for all. But Jake wasn't afraid. He stepped forward, his voice carrying over the wind to his people. "This is our moment," he called out, his words steady and strong. "They tried to break us. They tried to erase who we are, but we've shown them the truth. We are not their slaves. We are not their food. We are human, and we will fight." A roar of defiance erupted from the rebel army, their voices rising together in a sound that echoed across the battlefield. The ground trembled beneath their feet, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the power of unity, of a people reclaiming their destiny. Vorak roared in response, his massive wings beating the air as he surged forward, leading the Drakith charge. The sky darkened as the dragons took flight, their shadows stretching across the land like a tide of death. But Jake stood his ground, his heart steady as he raised his blade. "For humanity," he shouted, and the rebels surged forward, meeting the dragons with a fury born of generations of suffering and a newfound strength that could not be extinguished. The clash was immediate and brutal. Dragons swooped down from the sky, their fiery breath scorching the earth, but the rebels met them head-on. Jake moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his blade finding the weak spots in the Drakith's scales, his body fueled by the ancient power that now pulsed within every fiber of his being. Around him, his comrades fought with a ferocity that matched the dragon's own, their eyes blazing with the knowledge that they were no longer prey. They were equals. Ova fought by Jake's side, her movements fluid and deadly. Together, they carved a path through the battlefield, their synergy a testament to the bond they had forged through countless battles and shared struggles. The Draketh were powerful, but they were not invincible. For every human that fell, a dragon followed, their dominance chipped away by the relentless assault of a people who refused to be broken. But Vorak was different. The Dragon King descended upon the battlefield like a living storm, his massive form crashing into the rebel ranks with devastating force. His claws tore through steel and flesh alike, his roar a sound that seemed to shake the very earth. Jake saw him coming, felt the ground tremble beneath his feet as Vorak charged. This was the confrontation he had known was inevitable. The final battle between man and beast. Jake met Vorak head-on, their clash sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The dragon's strength was overwhelming, his attacks relentless, but Jake was faster, more agile, and driven by a purpose that gave him strength beyond anything the Draketh could comprehend. They fought with everything they had, their battle a blur of steel and fire, of ancient power clashing against ancient tyranny. Vorak roared in frustration as Jake dodged another of his crushing blows, the dragon's massive claws slamming into the ground where Jake had stood just moments before. Jake retaliated with a swift strike, his blade slicing through the softer scales beneath Vorak's jaw. The Dragon King bellowed in pain, but he wasn't done yet. The battle raged on, neither side willing to give an inch. But Jake could feel it, the shift in the tide. The rebels were holding their ground, their newfound strength turning the tide of battle. The Draketh were faltering, their centuries of dominance crumbling under the weight of human defiance. With a final, desperate roar, Vorak lunged at Jake, his jaws wide, and his eyes burning with rage. But Jake was ready. He sidestepped the attack, using the dragon's momentum against him. With a surge of power, he drove his blade deep into Vorak's chest, piercing the heart of the beast that had ruled over humanity for so long. Vorak let out a final, shuddering roar before collapsing to the ground, his massive body shaking the earth one last time. The battlefield fell silent as the remaining Draketh, seeing their king defeated, fled into the skies, their dominance shattered. Jake stood over Vorak's fallen form, his chest heaving with exhaustion and triumph. Around him, the rebels began to cheer, their voices rising in a victorious chorus that echoed across the battlefield. They had done it. They had won. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting its golden light over the battered but victorious rebels, Jake turned to his people. They stood together, bloodied but unbowed, their faces lit with the realization of what they had achieved. "This is our world now," Jake said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "The dragons are gone, but we must remember what we've learned. Our strength doesn't come from artifacts or ancient power. It comes from us, our unity, our courage, our will to fight for what's right." Ava stepped beside him, her eyes shining with pride. "We rebuild, we remember, and we make sure this never happens again." The rebels nodded, their hearts swelling with the promise of a new future. The war against the Draketh was over, but the journey of humanity was just beginning. They would rebuild their world, stronger and wiser, carrying the lessons of their past into a future where no one would ever forget what it meant to be human. As Jake looked out over the rising sun, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. Humanity had reclaimed its place in the world, and the future was theirs to shape. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the mountains, the ancient symbols glowed once more, a reminder of the strength that had always been within them, waiting to rise.